Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this session on making owners' project requirements, or OPRs, great again. Hopefully through this presentation, you'll get some more insight, maybe some ideas on how to make your OPR documents a lot more useful throughout the life cycle of your project. My name's Stevan Vinci. I'm with Morrison Hershfield. I am our Building Envelope Commissioning Practice Lead for North America.
And I'm Mike Flemming. I'm with Interface Engineering. I'm based out of our San Francisco office. I'm an associate principal, and I'm the team leader of the the commissioning team for the San Francisco and the Hawaii offices.
So a lot of people always wonder, what an OPR is supposed to be. It's often thought as something solely related to commissioning, or it's that document you just need to meet a lead requirement. It should be something that includes all the requirements from a programming, aesthetic, performance of a building through its service life. A lot of these are always forgotten. Sometimes they're just copied and pasted from project to project without any thought on the huge impact that they could have from the design or life cycle of a project. A lot of the times they're even just put together at the end of design to match the design just to meet a lead submission. Simplified, it should be your roadmap. It should be the primary document, benchmark quality across all phases of a project. We found whenever an OPR is developed early on in the process and is basically deemed a living document, it'll benefit all the stakeholders. It'll provide you a document for the service life of the building and would apply to any modifications to that building down the line, which is something that is very difficult to capture if you're just hoping that it could be captured in design or as-built documents. This is just a bit of a snapshot of your project timeline from a commissioning process perspective. You have your pre-design, design, construction, and occupancy. Your OPR should be updated and basically address each one of these phases, not just from the design perspective. You also want to make sure that your OPR is clearly worded, that where the owner's vision can be communicated to the team's vision. You want to make sure that the design team, all the stakeholders, all the project team members get a clear indication of what they're supposed to be doing for the owner to make sure the owner gets what they want. Doing this is making sure that you establish project requirements early on. You want to avoid any potential ambiguity, so you don't want something in there that the design team could take it as something else, and then when it comes back to it, the owner says, that's not what I meant, and it creates a bunch of redesign and going back and forth.
Now, while a lot of these images are no doubt a little bit overreaction or a little bit meant to be funny, there is always truth to the fact that anything that's changed later in design is always going to result in a little bit more coordination, or at least open up the chance that something like these things happen. One of the good examples is always networking requirements, and not having any IT or anything like that included in these initial information, in initial meetings or anything like that. And it's always left to be a secondary thought. But having those IT requirements early on, making sure that those requirements are set, makes it much easier to size mechanical equipment, both for the IT rooms and also the size of the IT rooms as well, so that the architectural can utilize as much of the space as possible. These coordination issues end up slowing down projects, end up resulting in wasted space or wasted money, and it's all due to the fact that you're not having those real clear requirements early on in the project.
Yes, and there are a lot of, most OPRs do lack some of these clear requirements, any direction given to design team, especially with respect to the building envelope as well. Rarely do you see anything in there beyond just wanting curtain wall or a certain type of cladding system. It really lacks a lot of the direction from a performance perspective. These are just a list of some of the requirements, objectives that you would have in an OPR. We're not going to list them all here, but with recent increased performance requirements coming out of cities, green building rating systems that keep changing every few years, new elements are being introduced that will have an impact on the design. as well as increased scrutiny on performance-related, items like resiliency, health, energy, and even carbon now are becoming the driving forces of certain codes. There's a huge opportunity that would be missed by both owners and designers on establishing a clear set of requirements that'll lead to a better, higher performing building that the owner actually wants. In looking at a few of these objectives, a lot of the times certain things have an effect or get overlooked. So budget, most times because of budget, the durability requirements get ignored or pushed to the side. And what we mean by durability is basically meeting a certain service life of the building. So sometimes if something is too expensive, then they put it to the side without adjusting the expectation from a service life perspective. And on the bottom, we've highlighted operations because rarely do we ever see an OPR updated or that is developed to be used for the operation of the building.
One of the words that you also have listed there I find really interesting as being the schedule one. And I believe that that can sort of have two meanings when it comes to an OPR. The first one can be the construction schedule. And are the dates that are being put out there realistic? The expectations of the owner, something that can be met by the design team, by the construction team, and by all the other players in the game. And another item that can be talked about as schedule too is linking to that operations that you were talking about, and really what the schedule of the building, what the schedule of the spaces are going to be. And having that important factor in there is there going to be one room that needs to operate 24/7 that requires power, that requires equipment to be on a lot more often than it's supposed to, because that wasn't mentioned early on, that one space was different and was special and needed to have those special requirements.
So when you're looking at owner's project requirements, you can look at it from a high level perspective. So you're going to start out with some general objectives. You can see here the list. There's quality, service life, budget, use or expansion, the owner's vision, the energy requirements. You need to start talking about what is important and how we can assist the owner in making the correct decisions. These can start out with being high-level needs of the owner, looking at what the needs of the users and occupants of that building. You should make sure that they include restrictions and limitations as well, because owners will have their preferences and dislikes. This is basically different than sometimes we've seen people just accept the architectural programming elements and call that an OPR. But that shouldn't be an OPR, because your OPR should start to be developed prior to architectural programming, because that's basically when the start of architecture begins, is the architectural programming. I would recommend you focus on owner directives, looking at the user requirements, come up with certain criteria within this. So, if you're looking at things from a budgeting perspective, maybe in this you've developed a life cycle cost criteria of what the owner is going to be looking at from a life cycle costing perspective. Maybe adding in some criteria of how they're going to evaluate each design submittal, how they're going to look at construction activities, and even having requirements during occupancy, and making sure that you benchmark each of those requirements. From the high level stuff, then you're going to start to drill down. You start getting into specific objectives. Is there sustainability goals? What's your equipment and water efficiency, life expectancy, maintenance expectations? There's a lot of things you'd start to drill down with.
On top of that, there's going to be the operational side of it as well, is the specifics of how the space will be operated, how the space will be maintained. As more and more systems are coming out, there's more and more control systems, whether it be lighting controls, mechanical controls, standalone controls built into specific units. And with each of those, we're seeing more and more software as a service or any sort of maintenance contracts or things like that. I recently had a project that all the different types of equipment were installed, and each had proprietary softwares and controls. And it turned out that the maintenance operations team now needed to pay a different contractor to service each piece of equipment because controls were different. So having that conversation and understanding how the space will be operated and maintained really makes a big importance for the life cycle costs and for the operational cost of the equipment and the systems that are being selected for the project.
Over the next few slides, we'll go through a few examples of OPRs that we've seen that are out in the industry. This one, it's very short. You can look at it, it's just very brief narratives talking about everything from, the landscape, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, the building envelope. It's great, it's a good start, but there's nothing in there. There's nothing very quantifiable from a performance perspective or anything in here that really gives direction for design teams. This leads into that sort of issue about introducing ambiguity from an OPR to the design team. So there's nothing really much here. They could go any which way they want to. A design team can read this in very different ways. This next one is a section just taken from the building envelope section of it. The rest of the document is very similar. It's a very simple OPR, but one of the things that makes it a bit better than the previous one is that the performance targets are documented. You look at everything from a design perspective, there's a lot of things in here that they can meet. One thing I would argue with this type of an OPR is that it doesn't really serve much purpose after the design phase. The next few slides will go over one example that we found is to be one of the better ones we've seen in the industry. We had an owner that their owner project requirements, they deemed the document called their technical criteria. So it's basically a document that's created before design. So it's used from pre-design through post-occupancy in order to benchmark all the performance and confirm the requirements to the owner are being met throughout the project. So you can see how the sections are put together. Each section, there's an intent, what the intent for that piece of equipment or the section of the OPR is. You give a description and performance, and some of the performance are related into tiers. So it's basically, what's the lowest tier that they'll accept, and maybe there's some efficiencies that meet their budget where project teams can achieve the higher tiered level of performance for the owner. As well, one of the great things about this document is that there's also a verification and validation section to each of it. It's basically, these are things that could go beyond what would be in a typical submittal in a spec section, but you can see here they're going to require certain things to verify and validate you're meeting their performance and their requirements from the design phase, construction, and post-occupancy. And it's basically things submitted to the owner so they can understand and keep up with the project. So here's one of the sections. So this is sort of that high level requirement section from your exterior vertical enclosure, so your building envelope. So it goes through, they've clearly described the intent of what they want to achieve for their buildings, looking at different building science design principles in here, as well as there's a section for the description and performance of each of these components, as well as you can see on the section C, so there's the verification and validation of all tiers. So again, these are things that have to be submitted to the owner from the design team to make sure that everything is being adhered to, the benchmarks are being met, performance is being met, they're getting exactly what they want. This one is sort of that next phase drill down, that next step down. So the previous slides dealt with the building envelope as a whole, so now we're getting into each of the components of the building envelope. So this one deals with windows, so it could be any type of windows, whether it's a punched opening, storefront, curtain wall, all of that. This will address everything. So it basically goes through the design, what they want from a performance perspective. You're going to have throughout everything from all your sort of lab testing, field performance, all of that. Everything here is showing a drill down of the previous slide. The great thing about this document, I found, is that it is written from a performance perspective. Sometimes people get too in depth looking at too much prescriptive requirements. The owner, in this case, did not want to do that because they found that doing something too prescriptively may put the design team sort of in a corner of not allowing them to use their creativity, not allowing them to sort of meet a certain performance using, perhaps there's some new technology out there, a new system that has come out, over the course of design or between projects. There is, however, some prescriptive requirements in here because, as we mentioned before, an owner had an unfavorable experience with perhaps a type of material, an assembly, or a piece of equipment. So those are easy to check off to make sure that that the design team is meeting that. But I find that wording it from a performance perspective allows a lot more flexibility and creativity from design teams to meeting the owner's requirement. One thing when we're talking about, OPRs and commissioning, we just wanted to touch base briefly on a bit of this disconnect between whole building commissioning and lead commissioning. If an owner in his owner's project requirements is starting to talk about commissioning all these systems to do a whole build, basically doing whole building commissioning, and then at the end your RFP or you're going out to get a scope of work is based on lead commissioning, they need to know that lead only requires certain systems to be commissioned, where your OPR may include some additional requirements.
And it's always good in that OPR document to really clearly indicate what is the anticipation of commissioning, what is the anticipation of which systems will be commissioned in there. And we all know that there are so many other systems going into a project than is just included within the lead scope, even if you include the building envelope scope. So it's very important during this owner's project requirement portion of the project to really understand and make sure that ownership understands what's being done, and more importantly, what isn't being done as part of the scope. I know as a commissioning agent, there's nothing worse than facing your client at the end of the project when there's issues and saying it's not in my scope, and nobody really wants to be in that position. So really making sure that that's clear right from the beginning of what's included, what isn't included, and making it clear that if they do want it included, then let's make sure it is. But an owner's project requirement is a really good place for that information to be.
And regarding lead, there's even a bigger disconnect related to the building envelope commissioning prerequisite, where the OPR may require, testing certain performance, things to be done during construction. But when you look at lead, the building envelope in the prerequisite, the building envelope commissioning scope is basically having the inclusion of the building envelope and the OPR and basis of design, as well as reviewing those documents and doing one review of the project design. So if you have all these requirements in your OPR and you're not doing the enhanced envelope commissioning credit in lead, who's looking out for the owner after this is done? After the design review is complete and you've looked at the OPR and basis of design, who's looking after the owner's interests as it gets into construction and post-occupancy?
So we spent the first part of this presentation really talking about what goes into an OPR and really the importance of putting together that document. But the question really is what project team, whether it be ownership, whether it be the architects, the engineers, anyone else involved in the design project, wouldn't want to start a project with a single document that really goes over everything that the client wants from the project. And ultimately, I think everybody would like that. So the question is, why do so many projects not put together an OPR until late in the project, or sometimes not at all? So I think part of the real reason is partially because they don't know how to make a document. partially because the commissioning agent might not be brought on board early enough to really help spearhead that process of putting it together. Some ownership doesn't even know that the document exists, or ultimately it's because the design process is just so fast and so busy that there isn't time to really put together that document. So part of this presentation, what we really wanted to do was teach you guys as owners, as commissioning agents, as design engineers, as whoever you are listening to this presentation, of the process of putting together that OPR and how to keep it updated throughout the project and how to utilize it throughout the project so that it becomes that much more important of a document. So showing here, you can see what we have put together as our sort of development process for that OPR document. And the top line is probably what most people are familiar with. It's the design phase. It's when you put together this document, you issue it to the team, and then more often than not, it gets left until you're submitting it to lead and maybe referenced back a little bit during design reviews, but more or less not carried on very much into construction and definitely not into operations. So we want to walk you through that process so you can see how this document can be that much stronger. So we'll start with the design phase of it, where we really talk about putting together that initial template, putting together the team, and then also creating that first draft that goes out to the team. So beginning that development process of the OPR. I already sort of covered these a little bit, but really what are the challenges that are faced? First one's being a rush design schedule. As design schedules get tighter and tighter, more and more we're seeing that the SD documents really don't cover the same detail that they maybe did before. And we're seeing less and less in DD and less in CD, and all of a sudden everything's getting thrown together at the last minute. So through all of that, it's hard to get all those team members together to really sit down and go over a document that isn't in that streamline, important part of putting together that schedule. One of the other challenges is really having clients and owners who really don't understand the purpose of the document or really aren't very familiar with the document. Not too long ago, I was sitting down with a client on a project that we were in the 50% CD stage already, and I was sitting at a table with a very seasoned and experienced construction team that had been working on projects all across the country for years as the same team, working together, that really knows how to get through the construction process. And the concept of an owner's project requirement document was brand new to them. And as we sat there and went over the items that we had in the list, they slowly dawned on how great of an idea it is to have this process happen and how to really all get down and sit onto the same table and have a document that really importantly points out those goals of the project. So even the most experienced teams out there might not be experienced in going through an OPR process. And that's really the importance of getting commissioning on board and helping them to guide through the process so that they can understand. So some of the solutions for really getting this process started can really be having templates that are job specific or job type specific, so that we have all those questions clearly indicated to the team so that they know what to expect, they know what type of things we're going to be discussing. We want to make sure that we have a kickoff meeting with the team so that we can all get together and really come up with ideas. And then also to maintain that document and make sure that they understand the importance of it and they can see how it's being referenced to more and more often throughout the project so that on future projects they see its importance. And then finally, one of the really important things is to really allow the client or ownership or any other stakeholder in the project to be allowed to say they don't care when it comes to specific items or specific questions within the OPR. Because ultimately, if you continue to push too much, then you're going to get not the right answers that you want. So the first step in this is really to make sure that you have a template to begin from. You don't want to have to be starting new on every project that you're going for. You want to know that there's certain items to be discussed on a specific project and certain items that don't need to be discussed. If you're just doing a tenant improvement project, then obviously there really doesn't need to be any discussion about doing building envelope, or at least changes to the building envelope. You'll still need to make sure that existing envelope items are taken into consideration. Same thing with having very specific questions about lab spaces or medical spaces or anything like that when you're just dealing with an office. Being able to have very specific and concrete questions to ask to the team will make the process that much smoother, and will also save the time of your very important clients. You don't want to be sitting there wasting their time by asking questions that aren't relevant to their project. Ultimately, by making sure that you have the right questions there, you're also limiting the opportunities for someone to just say, not applicable, let's jump on to the next question. Once that sort of gets going and there's a string of those types of questions in a row, it becomes easier and easier to lose the interest of the people in the meeting, and a lot harder to get really good concrete answers out of them as well. And also, you want to make sure that your templates really do cover all of what's important to the project. Not always included in the sort of standard checklists of what should be included in an OPR, but very often operations don't get covered quite as much as they should. The training requirements for who will operate the building and maintain the building or use the building, and how much are they really getting trained in it, as well as any sort of sub-metering or any other requirements. And ultimately, one of the good things to really utilize in these templates is lessons learned from past projects, and being able to develop these templates so that they become stronger and stronger documents for any future projects. So once you have that document together, you share that with the team, make sure that they've seen it before and can come into a meeting with everybody with at least some ideas or some familiarity with what we're going to discuss. What's also important is to make sure that the right people are in the room. Very often you'll have these meetings, and you'll get one member from the design, or one member from the design team, maybe one member from the ownership team that's representing everybody. But ultimately, that's not going to be as strong of a meeting as you could have. So ultimately, you want to make sure that you're getting ownership. You want to get the project manager, the construction manager involved. You want to make sure that you're getting the end users involved if possible. Who's actually going to utilize the space, find out what's important to them when it comes to the space that they're going to be working and operating inside of. Also, you want to make sure that you're getting the maintenance and operations team. You're getting those facility engineers who are going to have to maintain the building, are going to have to operate the building, because what's important to them might not be covered, and then they'll be left with the problems later on. As I said earlier, you want to make sure that you're not pushing any items too much. If it comes to a sustainability aspect and the team really has no preference into, well, maybe we just want to do code minimum, or maybe we just want to do what we need to do, get by. This isn't the time to really push your preferences onto them or anything like that. Ultimately, you want to get that feedback from the project team and make sure that they're giving up as much of their answers and as much of what they really want in that project as they can. And as we mentioned earlier, this is a good time to really discuss what systems should be included in the commissioning process, and are we going beyond just lead and code requirements, or is that all that's interested as part of this project? So once you have those templates, you want to make sure in that meeting that you're asking those right questions. So some of the questions can be pretty simple. They can just sort of be, what's the primary purpose? What's the use of this project? Talking about very broad goals. The key with any of these questions is to make sure that they're simple enough and broad enough that we can have a discussion based off of it. Towards the end of this presentation, we'll go over a little exercise that is good to use during OPR meetings to get people talking and how to get ideas flowing out of the team. But ultimately, there shouldn't be anything too specific that can be answered with a very specific and general answer. The goal is to get a discussion going among the team members there so that we can truly dig deep and hear what's important to them. Another important thing that doesn't always get covered is especially with the facilities team, is there any equipment that they hate, any manufacturers that they'll never deal with again, any products out there that have just provided them nightmares that as soon as it gets included in this project, they're not going to like it right from the beginning. So these are usually good opportunities and good questions to ask if you do get those facilities managers into the meeting. So once you finish that meeting, you take all those notes as a commissioning agent or as the owner's rep, whoever it is that's in charge of putting together that owner's project requirement document. And you compile them all, you put them all in together into that template, and you create the first draft. This is by no means the final document. This is meant to be more of a meeting notes or a summary of really what was discussed and really what the team put together as part of that meeting. There's always going to be the opportunity for additions afterwards. And what you really want to do is give this draft to the team. So any additional ideas that came after the meeting, after reviewing it, or on the drive home from the meeting, we have that, give the entire team that opportunity to really provide additional detail later on.
This also allows a lot of opportunity. We mentioned, who would be the preferred people to have in the room for the OPR meeting. Sometimes due to schedules, it's very difficult to get everybody into that room. So distributing this first draft to the entire team allows for certain disciplines that may not have been in the room together, but have some synergies, be able to comment and see what the other person was thinking. For instance, sometimes some decisions related to the building envelope will have a big impact on the mechanical engineer when he's thinking about conditioning a certain space. So if he's going under certain assumptions but then sees something different, or vice versa, then that can be addressed with this first draft.
So after that draft goes out to the team, the key is to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to review it and provide any additional comments based on their review, based on anything else that's come to them after that meeting. Now, ultimately, you don't want to give them too much time, because if you give someone 4 weeks, then they won't look at it until the day before anyway. So we want to make sure that we put a deadline on that, but we want to make sure that we give them enough time to really provide well thought out comments and any sort of revisions to that initial draft. Then, as whether it be the commissioning agent or the owner's rep or whoever is putting together this document, you want to go through and compile all those comments. Make sure that everyone's voice gets put into this document, whether they were in the meeting or not. Make any necessary revisions. If necessary, if comments come back that conflict or maybe there's further discussion needed, then maybe it's a importance of having that second meeting or having side discussions between certain members to make sure that the document's as strong and concrete as possible. One of the important things that I like to do when it comes to OPRs that I put together is to have key members of the project team who were involved in the creation of it sign it, put their name on it, put the date on there. That way there is a document that goes out to the design team that says at least this point in time, all these people agreed that this is what we wanted out of the project. As we all know from any project that we've been part of, a lot of things change from the beginning until the end. And while we hope that we will continue to update the OPR throughout the project, there does need to be a point in time that we have a document that says this was the guideline that was given, and that makes the process a lot smoother and a lot more comfortable for the design team, for the ownership team, and for a future construction team as well. And at that point, you want to make sure that you've got that document and you share it with the entire project team so that everyone understands these are the requirements for this project and for this design process, for the construction, and for the project that will get handed over later on. So congratulations, we've gone through design, we've created that owner's project requirement document, we've done a first draft, we've done a first issuance to the team, and maybe throughout design there's been a couple revisions to it here and there. Now we get into construction. This is new territory for typical owner's project requirements documents. Usually the document, as I said, gets created in design and then sits there until you're going for your lead submission. But the importance of having and revising this document throughout construction will help make it that much stronger of a document and help people respect and understand the process that much more. So in construction, it's important to make sure that this document is getting revised throughout major project milestones. When we go into the VE process, obviously things change. The goals from the beginning of the project might not be as important as once we realize the cost and the changes that are required to the project. What's also important is that we understand really what are the goals, what are the must-haves of the project versus what are the nice-to-haves of the project. And that's really important when it comes to the VE process, is to make sure that anything that we're doing in that process isn't counter to the project goals. And if anything is going to be lost by the VE process, we want to make sure it was the nice-to-haves, not the must-haves. It's also important to revise this document as submittals come in and as this project startup takes place as well, because things change. There's no doubt that things will get modified, whether it be through RFIs, whether it be through anything else. We want to make sure that the project and this OPR document reflects everything that's been going on along the way, and that ultimately the discussion is happening that we are referencing back to this and we understand if anything is changing when it comes to our goals.
Another thing here to point out with this part about the VE process is that look at all of the VE submittals from a holistic point of view. Sometimes they're just looked at with each discipline. So we've seen on some projects where they've done, value engineered out a better performing window or air barrier just for a more cheaper option. But what they didn't do was sort of confirm and consult with the mechanical design team or the mechanical commissioning agent to see what that could have an effect on the mechanical system, because they could still be installing their equipment thinking that the envelope still has a certain thermal or air leakage performance. So there could be some issues if you don't look at it from a holistic perspective. And also related to the lead points, I've seen on many projects is that a lot of people are more familiar with the MEP aspect of lead commissioning when it comes into the construction phase. A lot of the times what they don't realize is that the building envelope commissioning schedule is a bit different, because they should be on site as soon as you start doing construction. Could be as soon as you start putting a shovel in the ground if there's any below grade aspects to it. The issue with that is that the building envelope can't be fine-tuned during construction. You can't come in after the fact and make it more airtight and things like that. So there's a lot more site observation involved with building envelope commissioning than could be with mechanical electrical commissioning, because you want to make sure that the right materials are being installed, the right details are being achieved, everything there. So you're basically looking at it from a site visit to confirm the design performance, as well as the periodic random sampling of some field testing requirements as well. If you get too far down the line in construction and you miss some of these opportunities, there is the risk that you could lose your lead points if the lead reviewer deems that you didn't do enough testing or you've missed a certain section of the building. So that's something to keep in mind.
And as Stevan mentioned, well-developed OPR has tracking. It has sort of ways to ensure that during construction, what are we looking for? What are the goals? What are the specific items that we want to make sure that we're checking? What are the specific submittals along the way that we're ensuring, so that way we're still referencing back to that OPR document throughout construction. So now for something that's even more out there, utilizing the owner's project document during operations. Typically, The OPR document, as I've said, is very focused on the design phase, but the connection that can be made between the design and the operations phase by really referencing back and making the OPR document available to the facilities managers, to the building engineers, and to the entire operations team can make the whole process and the whole transition process to operations so much easier. The document should be utilized during training to really help familiarize the team with the building and the entire design project. The OPR document, when well written, has all the information needed to truly explain how the building, how the system should operate, what the capabilities of the systems are, what the intent of the design was, and really what the project goals were. When you have a building that's going for LEED Platinum and aiming to be super sustainable, utilizing natural ventilation or any sort of other system, the facilities managers and operators need to understand that maybe it's not going to be 70 or 72 degrees in the space at all time. But if that's not communicated clearly to the project team, and if they aren't aware of these requirements, and if they don't know and the users don't know that this is what the building was designed to do, then right from the beginning, there's going to be a disconnect and there's going to be problems for the entire team. So really utilizing this document to go full circle and make sure that the design intent and the design of the project is being brought to the operators and the users really helps to make the process that much smoother. As well, by using the as-builts of the mechanical, the sequence of operations, all of the other equipment, the building envelope, every component of those projects, and combining that in with the owner's project requirement document, you can help to put together the current facilities requirement, which is now LEED requirement as part of the commissioning for LEED version 4. And this also gives the facilities team one more tool that they can use and one more document that they can continue to update as time goes on to ensure that the building continues to design as intended. And if changes do come up, that they have a way to document it and they have a way to reference back to what it was supposed to do originally and how the changes that they're making reflect and how they will change the system as a whole instead of any just specific area. So utilizing this owner's project requirement document even into operations can really provide that much more value to the clients and makes the transition and callbacks later on onto the project that much better.
So over these next few slides, we'll go over some ideas for a collaboration exercise for OPR development during a meeting. I'm sure we've all been in some of these meetings where you have a bunch of people in the room and nobody's really saying anything. Nobody knows what the right questions are to ask. Maybe it's being dominated by two people doing most of the talking with everybody else just nodding off and nodding in agreement just to get their day done with and get out of that meeting as soon as possible. So this is basically an exercise I've had the fortune of being a part of a few times, and I've used it in some other meetings. It's basically called a 1-2-for-all exercise. So basically, with any meetings, I'm a stickler for keeping things on time. So I put basically a timeline in here. You want to engage everybody in the room, get as many ideas as possible and suggestions. So what you would do to start off is you'd post a challenge, phrase it as a question to gather the whole group's insights. People should be thinking about, related to that question, what opportunities do they see for making progress on this and how to bring benefit and recommendations to the owner to bring value to the project. So what you would do is once you've had the question either written on a board or communicated to the group, all the participants would sit there and basically take their own notes, jot down their own ideas, reflect on that question. Then they would get in pairs and basically share to your partner what your ideas were, and you'd listen to the other ones, and maybe you could build on each other's. From that, you would get into foursomes or even small groups where each person in that group would then share their ideas and maybe expand upon those as well. You can start to see in these groups, maybe there's some similarities, maybe there's some possible synergies, as well as some differences that could create issues for the project or related to that question. Once you've done that, you'd have one representative from each of the groups to share one idea at a time from their conversation. And what you would have is somebody would be recording these ideas from each of the groups. You want to make sure to get as many different and unique ideas. Encourage groups not to repeat insights from others. So you don't want people to be there saying, oh, I think we should take advantage of this, new technology from a renewable energy perspective and do this. And people just like, yeah, I think so too. That you're not getting much out of the room, especially when you have probably a lot of smart people in that room. Try to stick to precise timing. Don't allow people to over elaborate on their things. Make sure that there's nobody downplaying anybody else's idea, using that, oh, that's a terrible idea. You don't want any of that sort of mindset in that room. Sometimes when doing this, some people are very shy and don't really get the exercise. And once they see it, they're more talkative or more willing to share. So you could do a second round if needed. Basically, you want to get as many different ideas and feedback from the room, and nothing that's too repetitive. Once you have all these ideas down, the second part of it would basically look at all the ideas listed and start with what the entire room would say. Basically, what is your top 10 or top 5 ideas? Ideas can be strategies, or maybe there's something very aspirational way out there. Then you basically do a group discussion and put them on a table, something like below, because with any owner's project requirement or decision, cost is always one of the forefront of anybody's decision. So you look at this and, you look at it versus, what's the effort versus the cost. Maybe there's a way to achieve a certain performance by buying a really expensive piece of technology, right? So that could be a very light effort, but a lot of cost. Or maybe there's something that doesn't really cost much, but would take a lot of effort from the team to do, right? So that would be a heavy lifting, but a low cost. And once you have a lot of these things grouped like this, then the ownership group and the team can start focusing on sort of what's that low-hanging fruit. Here's where, as Michael said, what are the must-have versus the like-to-haves. And this is how you can start to group some of these requirements. Well, that's all we had for you today. Thank you for joining us. By all means, feel free to contact either one of us if you have any follow-up questions from this presentation. And we thank you for joining.